Thank you very much, Professor Nomikos. Thank you very much, John, for this wonderful introduction. This was very, very kind. Thank you very much also for the Indic Researchers Forum for having invited me. It's such a great pleasure to be there with you today, and I hope that as soon as the pandemic is over, we will also be able to meet each other face to face. So thank you very much for having me here. The topic that I want to talk to you today is, of course, the impact of the fall of Afghanistan and the takeover of the Taliban on Europe, and in particular, the impact on the refugee crisis, a very, very hotly debated topic in Europe, certainly since 2015, very, very much so, but even before then. So it is something very, very important, and I hope that I can bring you a little European perspective on how this crisis has been perceived. So let me start with a little background. I mean, the previous two speakers have given us a fantastic background in terms of the actual conflict in Afghanistan. So I won't go through this in any great detail, but I will go straight to the refugee crisis fairly soon, just to say that, of course, Afghanistan has had a long history of those internal and external conflicts, two wars with the United Kingdom, invasion by the Soviet Union, and, of course, the takeover of the Taliban. It's a country that is at a crossroads of a variety of different neighboring states with ancient trade routes, differing religions, major powers, buffer state. And of course, for the West, for the United States and for Europe, it really got into the focus of what we all kind of really wanted to know more about. It was, of course, a terror attack on the World Trade Center in New York on September 11, 2001. This is political memory that has shaped, obviously, my own research. This is something that really drew me in. And of course, as a result of that, I really focused a lot of my research on terrorism and counterterrorism. At the time, Osama bin Laden was identified, of course, as the leader of that terror organization, and subsequently was hunted down by the US government in a military compound in Pakistan, where he was eventually killed. In 1996, the Taliban, of course, took over and seized control of most of the country already. The Taliban at the time was already accused of supporting terrorists, and subsequently the Americans, after the September 11 attack, began conducting airstrikes on Taliban facilities in Afghanistan, and so on. We all know the outcome, but only to mention this to give a little background, because of course, when we talk about refugees, this little background is very important. So I want to give you a little background to make you understand the difficulty that we're facing today. Of course, the Taliban, when they were initially in power, they were gaining world prominence even before the 9/11 attack, when they destroyed the historic Buddhist religious art, which was one of the very horrific kind of examples of the Taliban rule at the time, that certainly in the West gained a lot of prominence. Subsequent to their takeover at the time, Afghanistan already constituted, and certainly today constitutes, one of the largest single refugee population in the entire world. There's about 6 million people, 30% of the global refugee population that is Afghan. The population has been greatly affected by refugee problems for many years. A number of those refugees are, of course, in Pakistan. A number of them are also in neighboring countries, whether that is in Iran, whether that is in other neighboring countries. Areas that were under Taliban controlled, of course, as you very well know, women had to wear burqas outside of their home. They had to be covered from head to toe. Schools were closed for girls. Professional women lost their jobs, were not permitted to work outside the home. 30,000 widows in Kabul had been denied employment. We're seeing some of those issues return subsequent to the takeover of the Taliban. Women had to endure very harsh treatment by the Taliban, whether that included beating women, executing women, and so on. So all of this is to say that, of course, a lot of people, a lot of refugees that were coming from Afghanistan were, of course, really persecuted in a way that I think many places in the world haven't seen. The kind of persecution that took place in Afghanistan was something that really was in a class or on its own. So one would think, to a certain extent, of course, that after the fall of the Taliban, there would be an outpouring of empathy and sympathy towards a lot of these people. When we look, however, empirically, what has really happened at the end of the summer of this year, following that swift conquest of Afghanistan by the Taliban, when interior ministers of the European Union met, they met for the first time on the 31st of August of this year in order to discuss the potential implications in the area of international protection, migration, and security. When they concluded their meeting, their statement suggested, and in fact emphasized, their intention to support third countries, in particular in their asylum capacity, with a view to ensure that those in need of protection receive it, and this is the important part, in their region of origin. So ministers highlighted that the EU and its member states would do their utmost to ensure that the situation in Afghanistan does not lead to new security threats for EU citizens, and they underlined the timely performance of security checks of persons being evacuated from Afghanistan that would remain crucial. It was a very strongly worded statement, perhaps a statement that we may not have expected before. Certainly, when we compare the situation to 2015, 14, 15, certainly this is a much stronger statement that was also echoed in other declarations made by European leaders in the margins of that very meeting. If we look at the Interior Minister of Slovenia, he declared that European leaders were afraid that this situation could result in terror attacks on EU soil. German Interior Minister Horst Seehofer also argued against identifying a target number of refugees from Afghanistan to be resettled in the EU, because those numbers obviously would trigger a pull effect, and we don't want that. All those declarations were met with obviously outrage with a number of non-governmental organizations and were criticized. But what they do show is that these debates have significantly changed since 2015 in Europe. Asylum seekers fleeing from Afghanistan in 2021 have largely been seen as security threats in the EU, and particularly at the level of member states. This is puzzling to a certain extent because of what I told you initially, that of course they are seen traditionally as victims, and in fact particularly when we look at the horrors of what the Taliban had been doing when they took over power the first time, and what can be expected perhaps also now, they were in fact victims of the perpetrators of very horrific violence. Nonetheless, at the level of European governments, this is increasingly seen as a security threat. Now, you might ask then, so how come these refugees and asylum seekers are being seen by European countries as a security threat? And I think at this point it is very important to point back to the situation in 2015 and 2016, because without understanding the situation in 2015, we cannot understand the reaction of European governments as we see it today. In 2015, we see that a lot of, in a sense, a lot of European governments, in particular the German government, I mean, this was the most symbolic statement that, of course, German Chancellor Angela Merkel made at the time when she said, we're welcoming those refugees with open arms. She kind of allowed quite a large number of refugees to come into Europe at the time. Some may argue that she didn't really have much of a choice because a lot of them were already on European territory, and I think Professor Nomikos knows this very well, of the situation in Greece that happened at the time. So a number of people might say she didn't really have a choice. It wasn't necessarily a policy decision as such, but it was something that she was sort of forced into. But nonetheless, the lesson that the German establishment drew from the situation in 2015, certainly other European countries as well, if we look at other major European powers such as France, if we look at the decision making in the United Kingdom, if we look at Italy, if we look at a large number of European countries, their idea initially that was undermined, of course, then by a number of terror attacks that occurred subsequent to allowing about 1.2 million refugees into the European Union in 2015. We had the terror attacks in Paris. We had a terror attack in Brussels. We had a terror attacks in Berlin. We had a variety of different terror attacks. Now, you may say, were they really refugees? And of course, this situation is debatable whether all of them were refugees. And of course, it is debatable whether, in fact, some of them had very close connections. But it is also been argued that at least part of that kind of asylum route had been used in order for some people that may otherwise have found it very difficult to enter the European Union, without being fully checked, without being fully controlled. And as a result of that, that has led to a certain insecurity. But more importantly than only the security threat, the political repercussions were very, very significant in the European Union. Certainly, the decision to allow a lot of those refugees into Europe was one of the reasons why subsequently Chancellor Angela Merkel decided not to run again in the next elections in Germany, which are being held just tomorrow. And she decided to step down as the leader of her party. We see similar things in other European countries where we see an increase in far-right movements that have made it very difficult for policy and decision makers to draw the same conclusions that occurred in 2015. So this is then fundamentally how we arrive at the situation in 2021, where when faced with potentially, and here I go back to my initial statistic, Afghan refugees are roughly about 30% of all the global refugee population. So they are very significant refugee population globally speaking. They are of course not all in Europe, but the potential is there for a lot of people to eventually make their way into Europe. In the face of such a political development, the reflexes in Europe are very, very clear. This is being seen as a potential security threat, particularly with the knowledge that, of course, when the Taliban take over the country, and as Professor Nomikos pointed out, when the Haqqani network, in a sense, leads the Interior Ministry in Afghanistan, an organization that has obviously been nominated as a terror organization for several years by the US government and by others, that does not reassure European governments that Afghanistan does not become, in a sense, a breeding ground for future terror attacks. And of course, using the refugee route is one of the ways in which those people may or may not enter the European Union. European governments at this point are not willing to take that risk anymore. And this has been said very, very clearly. And I think we're going to see iterations of those statements over the next couple of months. No matter which government is going to take office in Germany after the elections tomorrow, we will see a relative unity, I think, on this particular point. We will see that other European countries, certainly France, that has its presidential elections next year, where President Emmanuel Macron is likely to have to run off in a second round against Marine Le Pen, potentially would be very, very vulnerable to even lose the election if he were to give significant ground on those issues. So my statement here at the end is not necessarily to say whether or not refugees are a security threat, but certainly from the perspective of European governments, I think the question has been answered affirmatively, and we are going to see measures. Certainly, if we look at the eastern flank at the moment, we see how they've already been used for a kind of a hybrid warfare, when of course President Lukashenko of Belarus has already been using some of them.
developing new flight routes from Iraq and from Syria into Belarus in order then to push the refugees or migrants, illegal migrants, depending on how you look at them, into Poland, into the Baltic republics. So we see that potential could be there also for Afghan refugees. There's a very significant number of Afghan refugee population. Of course, we see potential adversary countries such as Iran that could play that role. In particular, also Turkey, of course, has been playing that role for a while on occasions in order to gain leverage in terms of money, but also other political. So European countries are going to try their very best not to go down that route. And as a result of that, they're unlikely to entertain anything like what we've seen in 2015. In fact, this has become almost like an essential statement of domestic politics in a number of countries. Certainly in Germany, it has become that way. So I will end on this note. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.